Well, my name is Alfredo Szklarek Kuruchet. I'm from the National University of Cordoba and CONICET, Argentina. And the title is Towards an Anti-Inflationary Policy in Argentina, Diagnosis and Difficulties. So let me start by showing some figures on inflation for Argentina between 2000 and 2022. As you can see in this figure, we have from 2000 to 2022, and we started with a very low inflation during the 90s. We had zero inflation. Then we have this peak in 2002 that reached 40% yearly inflation. And after that, inflation went down to almost 0%. But then we had this period between 2003 and 2007 where inflation started to go up and reach level around 25%. Then I would say that there is this other period between 2003 and 2017 where we had a relatively, because you can see there are some peaks and valleys, but around 25% inflation. And then after 2018, we reached an average inflation of around 50%. And now 2022, all estimates show that we will end up with an inflation rate of around 70%. So how can we understand what happened and how can we explain this inflation in Argentina? Well, I would say that it's important, first of all, to realize that inflation is a complex and dynamic phenomenon. It has multiple causes. It has bidirectional causes and indexation. So all these things make it a very, very difficult phenomenon to understand. And I would say that, and we need, of course, different theories. I would say that we can understand the inflation in Argentina by using these three theories. The first one is demand-driven inflation, so standard Keynesian theory. The other one is cost-push inflation. So these are very standard theories that are taught in Europe, the USA. But then we need to have this inertial inflation theory. And this is the central theory to understand what is happening. And I should say that Brazilian economists should be very proud for all the contribution to this theory. So let me tell you which are of these three theories I think are the best ones to explain inflation in Argentina during all these years. I have to remark that I'm just pointing out the main explanations. I still think that it's important to have in mind all these theories, but if we think about what are the main theories that can explain, I would say that between in 2002 we had this cost push inflation. Yes, basically what happened is that we had this fixed exchange rate, 1 peso, $1. And then we had this phenomenal crisis, and the exchange rate went from 1 to almost 4 pesos, $1. And that is what we have here. That's why inflation rate went up to 40%. But then because this was a one-time increase in the exchange rate, inflation went down. Okay, but then I would say that the period between 2003 and 2007, where inflation started to pick up, it was mainly explained by a demand-driven inflation. And then between 2008 and 2015, I would say that the main reason for our inflation was inertial inflation. Between 2016 and 2020, we had this inertial inflation and some cost push inflation due to exchange rate depreciation. We had a currency crisis. And then now, recently, 2021, 2022, we have both this inertial inflation, we have this cost push inflation, and this demand-driven inflation. So let me show you, for example, here the period 2003, 2007, why I think there was this demand-driven inflation, where there is an excessive growth of the aggregate demand with full usage of the installed capacity. As you can see, this red line is the inflation, and this yellow or orange line is the installed capacity, the usage of the installed capacity. So as you can see, after the 2001-2002 crisis, installed capacity was 50%. So basically, factories had a lot of machines that were not used. So then, when the economy started to pick up, as you can see, this usage started to increase to full usage around 2006, 2007. There we had the capacity was around 75%. So I would say that this period between 2003 and 2007-08 can mainly be explained by this demand-driven inflation. Yeah, we had this increase in why did we have an increase in demand, in aggregate demand? Well, we had, first of all, an increase in demand from abroad, so exports increased a lot. Mainly, we had there increases in commodity prices, soya, etc., things that both Argentina and Brazil export. And of course, that means that farmers increase their consumption investments. We had a very competitive exchange rate, real exchange rate, due to this big nominal exchange rate depreciation and relatively low inflation rate. So that allowed our domestic industry to increase exports to mainly Brazil, where our industrial exports are mainly oriented to. Then we had a very big increase in consumption demand because there was a big reduction in unemployment. Wages started to increase. And there was also a credit expansion of consumption. And then we also had a very expansionary fiscal policy. With this increase in GDP, of course, the tax revenues started to increase a lot. So the state had a lot of resources, and of course, started to have this very expansionary fiscal policy, increased construction and infrastructure investment, increased public employee, the number of public employees, the wages started to increase, and even pensions. Yeah, and I would say that here we have this macroeconomic policy mistake made by the government. I would say that around 2006 or even 2005, in the beginning, of course, we were growing at 8% a year between 2003 and 2005, but that was mainly because overall factories were available. But after that, the government should have had a contractionary, or at least a fiscal policy, or at least not as expansionary fiscal policy. So what I would say that there was this policy mistake. But what happened afterwards? Well, the inertial inflation started. Yeah, and just very briefly, I want to tell you what this inflation is, just in case, of course, the Brazilian friends know this, but maybe other colleagues from other countries doesn't know this theory. So this is a theory that is more related to the propagation mechanism of inflation, not to the initial causes of inflation. Yes, I would say that initial causes of inflation maybe are the demand-driven inflation and cost-push inflation. And basically, inertial inflation is an inflationary process. The process is very important, where increases in prices feedback to increases in prices. So, for example, increasing in past prices leads to increases in future prices, influenced by cost and relative price misalignments, expectations, and indexations. And the result is a relatively stable medium and high inflation. So basically, what one has to understand is that prices and wages are increasing, but this, I mean, if let's say that prices I have here a graph. If wages increases because prices have increased previously, now wages have to increase, and that implies that. But that implies that these increasing wages are also increasing the cost for companies, and then these companies have to increase their prices, and this circle starts going on. Yes. Another example could be where we have two goods and that are using both goods as inputs for their production. So the price of goods A is increasing, so that means that the cost for producing good B is increasing, so price B has to be increased. But if the price of good B is increased, the cost of price A is increased, so then they have to increase, and you have this spiral of increases. Yeah, and the same thing could be with thinking about the exchange rate. So if you have inflation that causes a real exchange rate appreciation, and you have to depreciate that real exchange rate, then you will have to do a nominal exchange, an increase in the nominal exchange rate. But an increase in nominal exchange rate will lead to increase in the cost of imported goods and even exported goods, and that will lead to increases in the prices. And again, you have a real exchange rate appreciation. Yes. So basically, what happens is that you have a coordination of expectations that will lead to higher inflation rate. Yes. So the inflation in the past lead to inflation expectations. Yes. And you also have this phenomenon of indexation of contracts. Yes. So if you're going to do a contract, a multi-year contract, like for example, property rentals or commercial multi-year contracts, or even labor and wage negotiations. So then you have this indexation. Yes. And another important feature to understand inflation, inertial inflation, is that there are these acceleration, deceleration factors, and basically these are factors that are increasing this inertial inflation. And basically that is if you have, for example, a demand-driven inflation, an expansionary fiscal policy, or cost-push inflation, if you have a currency depreciation, price increases of commodities and energy. And important in terms of policy to reduce this inertial inflation, it is important to have in mind that if the initial causes of inflation disappears, let's say if you had a demand-driven inflation or a cost-push inflation, if those disappear, that doesn't mean that inertial inflation will disappear. Yes. So you need to really attack this inertial inflation. Yes, and this is a big mistake that was made in Argentina, and I know even in Brazil in the 80s by these monetary economists that thought that, well, we just need to reduce the fiscal deficit, reduce the monetary financing of this fiscal deficit, and then everything will be fine. And basically what happened was a recession, but the inflation rate was still up there. An important question, I think, about this inertial inflation is When is inertial inflation started? Because as I said, inertial inflation is not a good theory to explain the initial causes of inflation. But once you have an inflationary process, I think it's the best theory to understand why this inflation continues in a stable and medium high inflation rate. So I would say there, when does an inertial inflation start? Well, when you have big and persistent demand-driven and cost-push inflation, yes? So basically, if we look back to the data in Argentina, as I said, this period was a period where there was a sustained expansionary fiscal policy, which led to demand-driven inflation. And that was a very big policy mistake, because after 2007, this inertial inflation just lit up and started, yes? And even here in this, in 2018, inflation went up because we had this currency crisis. And I would say that this really big currency crisis also ended up being an accelerating factor and increased inertial inflation. And unfortunately, now we have 50% of inflation, inertial inflation. And I would say that the latest movements, 2021, 2022, are having an accelerating factor again. And maybe we are now around 60% of inertial inflation. Let me show you what is happening now. In 2021 and 2022, this is the monthly inflation figures. So we can see that in May 2021, we had 3.3% of monthly inflation, but clearly from December, January, February, and March, April 2022, the monthly inflation rate went up a lot. So basically what we have here, what happened? Well, we have demand-driven inflation. Here, this is just a graph showing this darker blue line. It's just showing the profits of firms in Argentina. And clearly in 2021, the profits of companies started to increase because the prices, the demand was very strong, and they were they increased prices and increased profits, yes. But also because the real exchange rate started to appreciate since November 2021, the central bank started to increase the monthly depreciation rate of the nominal exchange rate. And right now, and even with the IMF agreement, we have to we cannot appreciate our real exchange rate. So now the monthly depreciation rate of the nominal exchange rate is around 4% monthly. And what is happening with wages? Well, that's the one of the main problems.
Alfredo, 5 minutes.
Perfect. Now we have these are the wage negotiations. We can see that in 2021, the negotiations were in the beginning of the year, they were 30%, but then they started to increase. And these red lines are what is happening now. And now we have around, well, some wage negotiations are around 85%, others are 60%, yes? So I think that's the reason why I think this inertial inflation is going up. So what anti-inflationary policy for inertial inflation? Well, this is it's a very simple idea, but very difficult to implement. Why is it very difficult to implement? Well, because it requires social consensus. You need enterprises, labor, and government to coordinate and work together. This is very different if you have a demand-driven inflation. Then you just need to have it's a decision of the government. You just need to have a contractionary fiscal policy or stop with this fiscal expansionary policy. Yes. So this is not only a decision of the government. It requires consensus. And the idea is that what you need to do is to have a gradual anchoring of a gradual downward anchoring of inflationary expectations. So you need a downward inflationary path. Just an example, let's say the first year you try to coordinate wages, prices, and the foreign exchange rate to increase 50%. The second year, you try to coordinate all these prices to increase 40%, and like that. And why is it important to have a gradual disinflation? Well, because you need to avoid big losers in case of relative price misalignment or deviation from this downward inflation path. If you are too ambitious, then probably you will not get this the consensus. Yeah, you have to like talk to enterprises, to labor organizations, and have this agreement. If they believe that they will be losing, they will not coordinate. Yes. And it's also very important that initially relative prices must be aligned. This is a real issue in Argentina. It is very important that the real exchange rate is not too appreciated, or tariffs and utility prices need to be upward adjustment, and real wages are too low. If these relative prices are misaligned, it's very difficult to reach also this agreement between all these parties. And then, of course, you need fiscal, monetary, and income policies to be consistent with this downward inflationary path. So finally, just let me tell you what the experience of Argentina can teach Europe and the US. And here I just show you the inflation in Germany as an example for US and Europe. And what we see here is that the inflation rate between 1960 and 2022, and we see this very relatively to Germany history, very high inflation of around 7%. But what we can see is that the history of inflation in Germany, at least this recent inflationary history, is that it's an inflationary rate that goes up, but then quickly goes down, up and down, up and down. And I believe that this increase in inflation rate will just be temporary and will go down. I don't think that inertial inflation will pick up in Germany. And the reason is that, I mean, real wages, if you have an inflation rate of 8%, maybe real wages are, nominal wages might be going up 2, 3. In the US, they are going up 5% a year in the last year. So I don't think that the wage negotiations will change a lot. You know, it would be very different if you have 20% of inflation. Yes, or if this high inflation persists through time. Yes, so that's why I don't think that the inertial inflation rate will pick up in Germany. Okay, so thank you very much.